A black man named Malcolm Grant is wrongfully arrested by two corrupt officers who think they've just caught another suspect, but what they don't realize is that Malcolm isn't just any man. He's a nationally renowned civil rights attorney, a man who has spent years exposing police corruption and taking down entire departments. When his true identity is revealed, the entire precinct is thrown into chaos, and what started as a routine abuse of power turns into the biggest scandal Metrovale has ever seen. What happens when the law turns against those who swore to uphold it? Let's find out, but before we dive into this explosive story, comment below where you're watching from today and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Malcolm Grant stepped onto the bustling sidewalk of downtown Metrovale, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement. The city pulsed with life, street vendors called out their daily specials, businessmen rushed past with phones pressed to their ears, and musicians played soulful tunes on the corners, filling the air with melody. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the skyline. Malcolm moved with quiet confidence, his tailored navy blue suit immaculate, his crisp white shirt neatly tucked beneath his dark tie. A briefcase dangled from his left hand, while his right hand adjusted the expensive watch on his wrist. He had just left a meeting with a client, a civil rights case that had drawn media attention. The stakes were high, but that was where Malcolm thrived. For years, he had built a reputation as one of the top civil rights attorneys in the country, bold, relentless, and unwavering in his fight against racial injustice. As he approached his sleek black sedan parked near the curb, he exhaled deeply, allowing himself a rare moment of exhaustion. Metrovale was a city of contrasts, prosperity for some, injustice for others. Malcolm had dedicated his life to tipping the scales toward fairness, yet every victory felt like a single drop in an ocean of inequality. He reached for his car keys just as two uniformed officers, Officer Caldwell and Officer Briggs, stepped onto the sidewalk, their eyes locking onto him with unsettling focus. "Hey, you!" Caldwell called out, his voice laced with authority. "Hold it right there." Malcolm frowned slightly but kept his demeanor calm. He turned to face them, his brow furrowing. "Is there a problem, officers?" Briggs, a younger officer with an eager glint in his eyes, scanned Malcolm up and down. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Malcolm gave a polite but firm nod toward his car. "I'm heading home. Is there a reason you're stopping me?" Caldwell smirked. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area." "You fit the description." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. He had heard this line too many times before. A well-dressed black man in a wealthy neighborhood was always suspicious in their eyes. "That's interesting," Malcolm replied smoothly. "Because I've been standing here for less than a minute, and I doubt you received a report in that time. Would you mind telling me exactly what this suspicious activity entailed?" Briggs shifted uncomfortably, but Caldwell wasn't fazed. His smirk deepened as he folded his arms. "Step away from the vehicle?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, his mind already racing through possible outcomes. He had fought countless cases just like this, unwarranted stops, baseless accusations, abuses of power. He knew his rights, but more importantly, he knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. "Officers, if you're asking me to step away from my own car, I have to ask, am I being detained?" Briggs' face hardened. "Don't play smart with us. I'm simply asking for clarification," Malcolm said evenly. Caldwell's smirk faded. "You know what? Hands on the car." Malcolm clenched his jaw. They weren't interested in reason. This was about control. At that moment, the world around them seemed to slow. People on the sidewalk stopped, some turning their heads, others instinctively reaching for their phones. An elderly woman, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years, stepped forward. "I know that man," she called out. "He's Malcolm Grant. He's a lawyer. This isn't right." But the officers ignored her. Briggs moved first, grabbing Malcolm's arm, twisting it behind his back. Caldwell shoved him roughly against the car, pressing his weight onto Malcolm's back. "You're under arrest," Caldwell said coldly. "For what?" Malcolm grunted, feeling the harsh bite of steel as the cuffs clamped around his wrists. Resisting an investigation, Briggs sneered. A chorus of shouts erupted from the crowd now gathering. Phones were out, cameras rolling. The people of Metrovale knew exactly what was happening, and they weren't going to let it be buried. Mrs. Hayes, her frail hands shaking, pleaded with the officers. "This is wrong. Let him go." You'll regret this? But the officers were deaf to her words. Malcolm closed his eyes as he felt his body tense. He had fought for others in this same position, but today, he was the one being thrown into the system. As the officers led him toward the squad car, the last thing he saw before being shoved into the back seat was the sea of faces watching, some horrified, some angry, but all bearing witness. Inside the police precinct. The ride to Metrovale Central Precinct was eerily silent. Malcolm kept his breathing steady, his wrists aching from the unnecessarily tight handcuffs. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of breaking his composure. When they arrived, the officers processed him with casual indifference, ignoring the firestorm that was already brewing outside. As Caldwell shoved him into a holding cell, he smirked. "Not so smart now, huh?" Malcolm met his gaze steadily. "You have no idea what you've done." Caldwell laughed. "Oh, I think I do." The door slammed shut. Minutes passed, then an hour. Then, footsteps echoed down the hall. A young officer, Damian Lewis, approached the front desk, a file in his hands. He had been tasked with running Malcolm's information, but when he saw the results, his face paled. He quickly scanned the database again. This couldn't be right. He turned to Lieutenant Rachel Monroe, a sharp, no-nonsense officer who had been transferred to Metrovale just months ago. "Lieutenant," he whispered urgently. "We have a problem." Monroe looked up from her paperwork, unimpressed. "What is it, Lewis?" "The guy they just arrested. Malcolm Grant." Lewis swallowed hard. "He's a civil rights attorney." Monroe raised an eyebrow. "Not just any attorney," Lewis continued. "He's been taking on cases against corrupt cops for years. He's won lawsuits against entire departments. If we don't do something, this is about to become a national scandal." Monroe's blood ran cold. She snatched the file from his hands and skimmed through it. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She turned to the holding cells, her gaze locking onto Malcolm's calm but calculating expression. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a catastrophe. And it was about to explode. Malcolm Grant sat on the cold metal bench of the holding cell, his hands resting loosely on his lap. The faint hum of fluorescent lights above him buzzed in rhythmic contrast to the occasional bursts of laughter and chatter from the officers outside. His tailored suit, once pristine, was now wrinkled, his wrists sore from the tight handcuffs that had finally been removed. Despite the discomfort, Malcolm remained composed. He had spent his career defending people caught in this very situation, black men and women unfairly targeted, wrongfully detained, treated as criminals before they were even given a chance to speak. Now, he was the one behind bars. A part of him found bitter irony in it. He knew his rights. He knew the law. Yet none of that had stopped officers Caldwell and Briggs from throwing him into this cell like a common thug. The law had never been about justice for men like him. It was about control. His thoughts were interrupted by approaching footsteps. Outside the holding cell, Officer Damian Lewis hesitated, clutching Malcolm's file tightly in his hands. His fingers drummed against the folder as he took a deep breath. He had heard stories about Malcolm Grant, everyone had. The man was a powerhouse, a champion of civil rights, a lawyer feared by corrupt cops across the country. Lewis turned toward Lieutenant Rachel Monroe, who stood with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the precinct like a hawk surveying its prey. She had barely been in Metrovale for 6 months, transferred from another city after exposing a botched case in her previous precinct. She was tough, methodical, and, unlike most of the officers here, still had a conscience. "Lieutenant, we have a serious problem," Lewis said in a low voice. Monroe raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Lewis handed her the file. "The man they arrested, Malcolm Grant, is a nationally recognized civil rights attorney. Not just any attorney. He's the one who exposed the wrongful conviction scandal in Detroit. The one who dismantled the racial profiling unit in Atlanta. And now he's sitting in one of our cells because 2 hot-headed officers wanted to flex their power." Monroe's face remained unreadable, but Lewis could see the flicker of realization in her eyes. She flipped through the file, reading Malcolm's case history, his high-profile victories, the lawsuits he had filed against corrupt officers. The precinct was in trouble. She exhaled sharply. "Tell me Caldwell and Briggs have no idea who they just arrested." "They have no idea," Lewis confirmed. Monroe pinched the bridge of her nose. "Idiots." They both turned toward Malcolm's cell, where he sat, staring at the floor, lost in thought. He hadn't said a word since arriving, no protests, no threats of lawsuits, nothing. That made Monroe even more nervous. A man like Malcolm Grant wasn't silent unless he was planning something. Monroe squared her shoulders. "Open the cell," she ordered. Lewis hesitated. "Are you sure? If Caldwell sees." "I don't care what Caldwell sees. Open it." Lewis nodded and pressed a button on the control panel. The electronic lock buzzed, and the cell door slid open. Malcolm lifted his head, his expression unreadable as Monroe stepped inside. She met his gaze and saw something that sent a chill down her spine, not fear, not anger. Control. This man knew exactly what was happening. And he knew exactly how to make them regret it. "Mr. Grant," Monroe said, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm Lieutenant Rachel Monroe. I'm the head of internal affairs here at Metrovale PD." Malcolm gave a small nod but said nothing. Monroe shifted her stance. "Do you know why you're here?" Malcolm let out a dry chuckle. "I could ask you the same thing, Lieutenant." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm going to cut to the chase. You were wrongfully arrested. We know that. You know that. And if I'm being honest, this department is in a world of trouble because of it." Malcolm leaned back against the wall. "I'm listening." Monroe glanced at Lewis before continuing. "We need to get ahead of this before it becomes a full-blown crisis. If you agree to." The sound of raised voices interrupted her. Caldwell and Briggs had returned from their break, and the moment Caldwell spotted Monroe standing inside Malcolm's cell, his smirk vanished. "What the hell is this?" Caldwell barked, storming toward them. "Why is the cell open?" Monroe turned slowly, her expression cold. "Because I opened it." Briggs snorted. "He's a criminal. He should be in handcuffs, not having a conversation with you." Monroe took a step toward him. "A criminal? Funny. Because I just learned that the man you arrested is Malcolm Grant. You know, the nationally recognized attorney who's been taking down corrupt police departments for years." Caldwell's face paled. Briggs blinked rapidly, shifting his gaze to Malcolm. "No way." Malcolm finally stood, smoothing out his suit. "I was wondering when you two would realize." The weight of the situation hit Caldwell like a truck. The cameras, the witnesses, the social media posts, they had arrested the worst possible person. This wasn't some scared kid they could intimidate. This was a man who knew the law better than they did. "What's done is done," Caldwell snapped. He was resisting. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Resisting what, exactly?" "Walking to my own car." Caldwell clenched his fists. "You're lucky we didn't charge you with obstruction." Monroe stepped between them, her patience running thin. "That's enough. You two have screwed up badly, and unless you want to go down in flames with the rest of the department, I suggest you shut up and let the grown-ups handle this." She turned to Malcolm. "We're releasing you immediately." Caldwell scoffed. "Just like that?" "Not just like that," Monroe said, her voice laced with authority. "Internal Affairs will be investigating this entire incident, and if I find even a shred of misconduct, both of you will be answering for it." Caldwell gritted his teeth, but even he knew when he was outmatched. Briggs was already backing away, realizing the gravity of their mistake. Malcolm adjusted his tie. "I assume my belongings will be returned." Lewis nodded quickly. "Right away, sir." As Malcolm stepped out of the cell, the entire precinct seemed to be holding its breath. He turned to Monroe. "Lieutenant, you may have just saved your department from a catastrophe. But don't think for a second that this is over." Monroe nodded, a part of her already knowing what was coming next. Outside, the sounds of protesters had grown louder. The news had spread. People were demanding answers. As Malcolm was led toward the front doors, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the city of Metrovale held its breath. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Malcolm Grant stepped out of the precinct doors and into a firestorm. The street outside Metrovale Central Precinct was unrecognizable. Protesters, activists, and members of the media had swarmed the area, their voices blending into an overwhelming roar. Signs demanding justice, fists raised in solidarity, and the flashing lights of news cameras filled the night. The moment Malcolm appeared, the crowd erupted. "Malcolm! Malcolm!" people chanted, their voices merging into a rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the streets. Journalists surged forward, microphones and cameras aimed directly at him. The city of Metrovale, and soon, the rest of the country, was watching. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe stood beside him, tension in her posture. She had ensured his release, but she knew this was far from over. A media disaster was unfolding before her eyes, and there was no way to contain it now. Malcolm took a deep breath, adjusting his suit jacket. His wrists still ached from the cuffs, and his body was sore from being slammed against the car. But he refused to show weakness. Chief Raymond Holt, the highest-ranking officer in the Metrovale Police Department, stepped onto the precinct steps, his face red with frustration. He had been blindsided by the news of Malcolm's arrest and was now standing at the center of a growing scandal. Holt raised his hands, trying to silence the crowd. "I want to assure the people of Metrovale that this department takes any accusations of misconduct seriously. We are reviewing the situation internally and will ensure that all appropriate actions are taken." The crowd wasn't satisfied. Boos rang out. "Lies," someone yelled. "We saw what they did." Malcolm took a step forward, his presence commanding. Without raising a hand, he gestured for silence, and the crowd obeyed. Now, all eyes were on him. "Let me be clear," Malcolm began, his voice strong and unwavering. "Tonight, I was not just another black man wrongfully arrested. I was a man in a suit, a lawyer, an officer of the court, and yet that still wasn't enough to protect me from racial profiling. If someone like me, who understands the law, who knows his rights, can be treated this way, then imagine what happens to those who don't have a voice." The crowd murmured in agreement. "I have spent years fighting for the rights of people who have been harassed, profiled, and brutalized by this very system. And now, I stand before you as living proof that this system is broken." Reporters scribbled notes furiously. The cameras zoomed in on his face. "This is bigger than me," Malcolm continued. "This is about every person in this city who has been stopped for no reason. This is about every mother who has had to teach her son how to survive an encounter with the police. This is about the countless names we never hear, the victims who never get justice." The energy in the crowd shifted from anger to something deeper, determination. "I refuse to let this be swept under the rug. There will be consequences. There will be accountability. And if this department thinks for 1 second that I will walk away quietly, they are mistaken." Applause erupted. Chief Holt's jaw tightened. He turned toward Monroe, his voice low. "You need to get him out of here before this turns into a full-blown riot." Monroe sighed. "Chief, this isn't a riot. It's an awakening." Holt's fists clenched. "Then we have a serious problem." Monroe watched Malcolm standing before the crowd, his presence magnetic. She had spent years in law enforcement, but something about this moment felt different. She wasn't looking at just another angry citizen, she was looking at a man about to change everything. Inside the precinct, Officer Caldwell and Officer Briggs watched the scene unfold on a monitor inside the precinct security room. Briggs swallowed hard. "We're screwed." Caldwell scowled. "Relax. This will blow over. It always does." Briggs wasn't so sure. "He's not like the others." Caldwell cut him off. "He's just another loudmouth lawyer." But as they stared at the screen, watching Malcolm command the attention of an entire city, the first seeds of doubt began to creep into Caldwell's mind. The movement grows. The next morning, Metrovale woke up to a headline that shook the city. "Civil rights attorney arrested in racial profiling incident, Metrovale PD under fire." News outlets across the country picked up the story. Footage of the arrest, captured by multiple bystanders, spread like wildfire. By noon, protests had erupted across the city. Signs reading "Justice for All, End Police Abuse," and "We Stand with Malcolm" filled the streets. Malcolm's office was flooded with calls, from reporters, from civil rights organizations, from lawyers across the country offering their support. And then, the call that changed everything came in. A woman's voice on the other end of the line said, "Mr. Grant, we have information you're going to want to see. I think this goes deeper than you realize." Metrovale Police Headquarters. Chief Holt slammed his fists on his desk, the veins in his neck bulging. "This is a disaster." Lieutenant Monroe remained calm. "We need to take control of this before it gets worse." "You think it's not already worse?" Holt snapped. "We're being called racists, corrupt, power-hungry." Monroe cut him off. "Maybe because some of us are." The room fell silent. She leaned forward, her voice firm. "Chief, I've been here for months. I've seen the way this department operates. There is a culture of targeting, profiling, and abusing power, and it's not just 2 officers. It's the entire system. We either face it, or we watch this department crumble." Holt exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. What do you suggest? Monroe's eyes darkened. We start with an internal investigation, but not just on Caldwell and Briggs. We look at every case in the last 5 years. If we don't, the federal government will. Holt swore under his breath. He hated the idea, but he knew she was right. Malcolm's office. Malcolm sat at his desk, staring at the documents that had just been delivered to him. They were internal memos, emails, and disciplinary reports, documents that had somehow been leaked from inside the Metrovale Police Department. The information was damning. It exposed years of wrongful arrests, fabricated reports, and a systematic effort to cover up police misconduct. Someone inside the department had sent this to him. Malcolm's hands tightened around the papers. This wasn't just about his arrest anymore. This was about taking down an entire corrupt system. He picked up the phone and dialed his legal team. Get ready, he said. We're about to start a war. Malcolm sat in his office, staring at the stack of documents before him. The papers trembled slightly in his grip, though his face remained impassive. He had spent years fighting for justice, but even he hadn't expected something of this magnitude to land in his lap. The memos detailed everything: wrongful arrests, internal cover-ups, fabricated reports, evidence of a systemic abuse of power within the Metrovale Police Department. Someone on the inside had sent this to him, and that meant one thing: there were cracks forming within their ranks. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The city was on fire, and he was at the center of it. Protesters were in the streets. National news had descended upon Metrovale like vultures. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, with journalists, activists, and lawyers all demanding to know what came next. His mind raced through the possibilities. If he handled this wrong, the department would find a way to bury him. But if he handled it right, this could be the beginning of something much bigger. The door to his office swung open. Naomi Carter strode in, her expression tense. She tossed a newspaper onto his desk, the bold headline practically shouting at him: Metrovale Police under fire, Attorney Malcolm Grant demands justice. Beneath it, a photo of him standing before the precinct, addressing the crowd. This is bigger than we thought, she said, sinking into the chair across from him. I've been speaking with community leaders, and they're ready to take action. They want to escalate the protests, demand independent oversight, push for real change. Malcolm nodded, skimming the article. That's exactly what we need to do. But before we make any moves, I need to know who sent me these. He gestured toward the documents. There's someone inside the department who wants this to come out. If we can find them, we have a direct line to their corruption. Naomi frowned. You think it's a cop? I know it is. No one else would have access to these reports. A knock on the door interrupted them. Malcolm's assistant, Jordan, peeked inside, his face pale. There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent? Malcolm and Naomi exchanged a glance before he nodded. Send them in. The door creaked open wider, revealing a familiar face. Officer Damian Lewis stepped inside, glancing over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed. His uniform was slightly disheveled, his jaw tight with tension. I don't have much time, he said, shutting the door behind him. If anyone finds out I'm here, I'm done. Naomi folded her arms. Why are you here at all? Lewis looked at Malcolm, determination flickering in his eyes. Because I'm the one who sent you those files. Silence filled the room. Malcolm studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. Why? Lewis exhaled sharply. Because I signed up to be a cop to help people, not to cover for power-hungry officers who abuse their badges. Caldwell and Briggs? They're just the tip of the iceberg. This whole department is rotten, and I'm tired of looking the other way. Naomi's skepticism didn't fade. And what do you want in return? Nothing, Lewis said firmly. I just want the truth out. He hesitated, then added, but I won't lie, I'm scared. If this gets traced back to me, I'll lose everything. Malcolm leaned forward. We'll protect you. But we need more than just documents. We need witnesses, patterns, proof that this isn't just a few bad cops but a systemic problem. Lewis hesitated before nodding. There's more. A lot more. I can get it to you, but I need time. Malcolm exchanged a look with Naomi, then nodded. Get us what you can. And be careful. Lewis stood, his jaw tight. You, too. As the officer slipped out the door, Naomi let out a low whistle. Well, I wasn't expecting that. Malcolm exhaled, rubbing his temples. Neither was I. But this changes everything. The protests outside had already begun transforming into something larger. It was no longer just about Malcolm's wrongful arrest, it was about decades of abuse, a system designed to protect itself at all costs. And now, with a whistleblower on the inside, they had a real chance to expose it all. Hours later, Malcolm stood outside his office, staring at the city skyline. The distant hum of chanting filled the streets, a reminder that this fight wasn't just his anymore, it belonged to an entire community. He had spent his life fighting battles in courtrooms, but this was a war, and he was ready for it. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. When the voice on the other end picked up, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm going public," Malcolm said. "Schedule the press conference." The conference room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking as journalists prepared to capture every word. Activists, community leaders, and legal analysts filled the seats, murmuring among themselves, anticipation crackling in the air. Outside, the streets of Metrovale swelled with protesters, their chants reverberating through the glass windows of the towering law office where Malcolm Grant was about to make his move. Malcolm stood at the podium, his expression composed but his mind razor-sharp. He had been in front of cameras countless times before, but today was different. Today wasn't about defending a single client or arguing a single case. Today was about dismantling an entire corrupt system. Naomi stood beside him, flipping through notes, but Malcolm didn't need them. He knew exactly what he was about to say. He had spent the entire night preparing, fueled by equal parts righteous anger and strategic precision. Jordan gave him a subtle nod from the back of the room. The broadcast was live. It was time. Malcolm took a slow breath, then spoke. "Good afternoon. My name is Malcolm Grant. I am a civil rights attorney, a citizen of this city, and as of 48 hours ago, the latest victim of Metrovale's broken justice system." The room was silent. The weight of his words settled over the crowd like a heavy fog. "On the evening of my arrest, I was not committing a crime. I was not resisting. I was not a threat. I was a man, standing beside his own car, detained under the false pretense of suspicious activity. That alone should concern every person in this city. But what concerns me even more is that my experience is not unique. It is part of a pattern of injustice that has existed for decades." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I have spent my career exposing these injustices in courtrooms across the country. But today, I'm not just here as an attorney. I am here as proof that no matter who you are, no matter how educated, how successful, how law-abiding, you can still be targeted, humiliated, and brutalized simply for existing in your own skin." A few gasps rippled through the audience. Some reporters scribbled notes furiously, others just stared, captivated. Malcolm reached for the stack of documents beside him, lifting them for the cameras to see. These are internal memos, reports, and disciplinary records from inside the Metrovale Police Department. These files detail years of misconduct, fabricated reports, wrongful arrests, excessive force, and deliberate cover-ups. A wave of whispers rolled through the crowd. Journalists leaned forward. The flash of cameras intensified. This is more than just two rogue officers abusing their power. This is an entire department operating under a culture of corruption, where certain officers are protected at the expense of the people they are sworn to serve. And today, I am demanding change. He set the papers down and met the camera directly, his voice unwavering. I am calling for an immediate federal investigation into the Metrovale Police Department. I am demanding the removal of every officer involved in this corruption. And I will not stop until justice is served. The room erupted. Shouts of support mixed with the rapid-fire questioning of reporters. Cameras zoomed in. The city of Metrovale, and the nation beyond it, was now fully watching. Malcolm raised a hand, signaling for silence. I have already filed a lawsuit against the department, he continued. And as of this morning, I have been joined by over 24 other Metrovale residents who have also been wrongfully arrested, harassed, or assaulted by this police force. This case is no longer about me. It is about every single person who has suffered at the hands of unchecked power. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. People exchanged looks, some nodding, others gripping their pens as if they could barely keep up. And to those who have been watching this city from the sidelines, wondering whether they should speak out, now is the time. If you have been a victim, if you have been silenced, if you have been afraid to come forward, know this, we will fight for you. And we will win. The final words shook the room. The moment he stepped away from the podium, reporters swarmed. Mr. Grant, do you believe Metrovale PD will cooperate? What response have you received from Chief Holt? Do you fear retaliation for exposing this? Naomi stepped in, her voice crisp and controlled. No further questions at this time. We'll be releasing more information in the coming days. As Malcolm moved through the crowd, people clapped him on the shoulder, shaking his hand, whispering their thanks. The movement had officially begun. In the depths of the Metrovale Police Department, Chief Raymond Holt watched the broadcast, his hands clenched into tight fists. His office felt smaller, the walls pressing in around him. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him carefully. "Well," she said after a long pause. "That was inevitable." Holt exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea what this is going to do to us?" Monroe met his glare without flinching. "Oh, I do. That's why I told you we needed to take control of this before it blew up in our faces. But you refused." Holt shot up from his chair. "And what the hell do you expect me to do now? Apologize on live television? Invite the damn feds in to investigate us?" Monroe shrugged. "It's either that, or wait for the courts to rip this department apart." Holt swore under his breath. "Caldwell and Briggs started this mess. And now it's on my desk?" "They were just the spark," Monroe said. "This department was already burning." Holt grabbed the remote, switching the screen to a different news feed. The protests outside Malcolm's office were growing, filling the streets like an unstoppable wave. He turned back to Monroe, his voice quieter but more dangerous. "We need to fix this." Monroe tilted her head. "Fix it? Or cover it up?" Holt didn't answer. But the look in his eyes was enough. Monroe's stomach twisted. She had joined this force to make change, to hold officers accountable. But if Holt was about to go down the path she suspected, then she had a choice to make. She turned toward the door, her mind already spinning. Malcolm Grant had just declared war. And Metrovale PD was about to fight back. The city of Metrovale was shifting. The air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. In the days following Malcolm Grant's explosive press conference, the streets remained flooded with demonstrators. What had started as protests had evolved into something deeper, a movement, a reckoning, a demand for systemic change. Malcolm sat in his office, exhaustion creeping into his bones as he scrolled through his phone. His inbox was flooded with messages, victims coming forward, civil rights organizations offering support, politicians cautiously reaching out to gauge their stance on the growing crisis. He had started a fire, and now the entire city was burning. Naomi Carter stood across from him, arms crossed. Metrovale PD just released a statement. They're denying any systematic wrongdoing. Holt called your lawsuit an opportunistic attempt to discredit law enforcement. Malcolm smirked. Predictable. They're scared. They should be. You have receipts, Naomi said, nodding toward the stack of internal documents on his desk. But you know this won't be easy. They're going to fight back. Hard. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp. Let them. We have the truth. They have desperation. Before Naomi could respond, Jordan stepped into the office, his expression grim. There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Malcolm and Naomi exchanged a glance. Who? Jordan hesitated. Lieutenant Monroe. From Metrovale PD. The air in the room shifted. Naomi tensed. This could be a trap. Malcolm considered it for a moment before nodding. Let her in. A moment later, Lieutenant Rachel Monroe stepped inside, her face unreadable. She was still in uniform, though she carried none of the arrogance Malcolm had seen in officers like Caldwell and Briggs. Naomi didn't bother hiding her distrust. You've got nerve showing up here. Monroe didn't flinch. I don't have time for hostility. I came here because I have information, and because I'm running out of options. Malcolm studied her carefully. Go on. Monroe exhaled sharply and pulled out a flash drive, placing it on Malcolm's desk. That has records even your whistleblower doesn't have access to. It proves Metrovale PD has been falsifying reports for years, manipulating crime data, covering up officer misconduct, retaliating against anyone who questions them. Malcolm's eyes flickered with interest, but his expression remained guarded. Why are you giving this to me? Monroe hesitated before answering. Because I don't want to go down with them. She met his gaze. I joined this department to make things better. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized there's no fixing this from the inside. The system is designed to protect itself at all costs. The higher-ups? They're already planning their response. They're going to come after you, Malcolm. Hard. Naomi's jaw clenched. We figured as much. No, Monroe said. You don't understand. They're not just going to fight your lawsuit. They're planning to destroy you. Silence settled over the room. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. Explain? Monroe sighed. Chief Holt is panicking. He knows if this lawsuit gains traction, Metrovale PD won't just face fines or firings. They'll be dismantled. The mayor is already under pressure to intervene, and Holt's only option now is to fight dirty. They're planning to discredit you, intimidate witnesses, and bury this case before it can reach trial. Naomi scoffed. Of course they are. Malcolm was unfazed. What kind of discrediting? Monroe hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded document. She slid it across the desk. This is just the beginning. Malcolm unfolded the paper, his eyes narrowing as he read. It was a fabricated police report, one accusing him of obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, and interfering with a police investigation. Naomi snatched the paper from his hands, fury burning in her eyes. They're framing you? That's their plan. Monroe nodded grimly. They're going to claim you've been manipulating evidence to push an anti-police agenda. They'll start leaking anonymous reports to the media, suggest you're financially benefiting from these cases, and push the narrative that you're a fraud. Malcolm clenched his jaw. He had expected pushback. But this? This was war. Naomi shook her head. And what? They think people will believe this garbage. They don't need people to believe it, Monroe said. They just need to create doubt. Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself. Then he looked up, more resolute than ever. Let them come, he said. We'll be ready. Monroe studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then you need to move fast. Because the moment this story gets out, you won't just be fighting Metrovale PD, you'll be fighting an entire system built to protect itself. She turned to leave but paused at the door. And Malcolm? Watch your back. They don't play fair. After she was gone, Naomi paced the room, still gripping the fabricated report like she wanted to burn it. They're actually doing it. They're going to try to take you down. Malcolm exhaled, his mind already spinning with next steps. They won't succeed. Naomi shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. What's the plan? Malcolm picked up the flash drive Monroe had left behind, turning it over in his hand. We expose them first. Naomi smirked. I like that plan. Malcolm looked out the window, watching the city below. The battle had officially begun. And if Metrovale PD thought they could silence him, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The night air was thick with tension. The hum of the city outside Malcolm's office was drowned out by the furious tapping of Naomi's fingers against her laptop keyboard. She was scanning through the files Monroe had delivered, her brow furrowed in concentration. Malcolm, seated across from her, leaned back in his chair, staring at the fabricated police report Monroe had given him. They didn't waste time, Naomi muttered, eyes flicking across the screen. Chief Holt must have had these documents ready before you even stepped out of that holding cell. He knew this was coming. Malcolm wasn't surprised. Holt wasn't just fighting to protect his officers, he was fighting for his career, his power, his entire legacy. The moment Malcolm exposed the department's corruption, it became a personal war. Jordan walked in, a tense expression on his face. It's already happening. The local news just ran a story questioning your credibility. Some anonymous sources inside Metrovale PD are claiming your lawsuit is politically motivated. Naomi let out a humorless laugh. Predictable, Jordan continued. There's also talk about you profiting from civil rights cases, suggesting you've built your career off exaggerating police misconduct. He hesitated before adding, and a few officers are claiming you've pressured witnesses in past cases. Malcolm exhaled slowly, setting the fabricated police report down on his desk. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. They just need enough doubt to shift the narrative. Naomi pushed her laptop away, rubbing her temples. So what do we do? Fight back? Or let them sink themselves? Malcolm was silent for a moment, his mind running through every possibility. He had fought cases like this before, but never with himself as the target. This wasn't about the law anymore, this was a war of public perception. We don't fight their lies, he finally said. We fight with the truth. Naomi sat up. How? Malcolm grabbed the flash drive Monroe had given him. We go public with this. Jordan looked uneasy. Are we sure? This isn't just a case of a few bad cops. You're talking about exposing an entire system of corruption. That's exactly why we need to do it now, Malcolm said. They're already trying to discredit me. The longer we wait, the more time they have to control the story. We need to release this information before they destroy my reputation. Naomi nodded, already opening her laptop again. I'll start compiling the files. We need to release them strategically, get them in the hands of journalists we trust, people who won't twist the narrative. Jordan hesitated. And what about Holt? If we do this, he'll come after you even harder. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Let him. The next morning, Metrovale woke up to a bombshell report. Every major news outlet had picked up the confidential documents leaked from Metrovale PD. The evidence of systemic misconduct was undeniable: dozens of fabricated reports, wrongful arrests, internal cover-ups, and even explicit orders to suppress evidence in officer misconduct cases. The backlash was immediate. Social media exploded. Activists flooded the streets in even greater numbers. Calls for Chief Holt's resignation spread across the city. Holt, watching from his office, slammed his fist onto his desk. His worst fear had come true: Malcolm had beaten him to the punch. Caldwell and Briggs, already suspended from duty, had gone into hiding, their names plastered across every news station as symbols of corruption. Lieutenant Monroe sat in the corner of the precinct, watching the chaos unfold. Officers whispered, some panicked, others angry. The tide was turning, and they all knew it. By midday, the mayor of Metrovale was forced to announce an independent investigation into the police department. Malcolm watched the broadcast from his office, his expression unreadable. He had spent his career tearing down systems like this, but this was the first time he was inside the storm. Naomi leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. You did it? Malcolm didn't respond. He wasn't celebrating yet. Because he knew this fight was far from over. Metrovale PD wasn't going to go down without a fight. And neither was he. The morning after the leaked documents shook Metrovale, Malcolm sat at his desk, staring at his phone. It hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. His inbox was flooded with emails from reporters, activists, potential plaintiffs, and even a few local politicians suddenly eager to align themselves with his cause. But there was one name that stood out. An unknown number. Naomi entered the office just as Malcolm picked up the call, pressing the phone to his ear. Malcolm Grant? There was silence on the other end. Then, a voice, low, nervous. Mr. Grant? You don't know me, but I used to work at Metrovale PD. I need to talk to you. In person? Malcolm's posture straightened. Who is this? A pause. Then, I'd rather not say over the phone. But I have information that'll help your case. Real proof. Not just documents, something bigger. Malcolm exchanged a look with Naomi, who raised an eyebrow. He muted the call. Another whistleblower? Naomi nodded. Could be a trap. Could be a break. Malcolm unmuted. Where? The voice hesitated. There's a diner on 7th Corner booth by the window. Noon. The call disconnected. Naomi sighed. And just like that, we're meeting with a mystery source in a shady diner. Sounds safe. Malcolm smirked. You don't have to come. Naomi folded her arms. Yeah, right. An hour later, Malcolm and Naomi stepped into Ralph's Diner, a small, unassuming spot tucked between a laundromat and a pawnshop. The scent of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air. The place was quiet, save for a few older patrons sipping their drinks. The man waiting for them in the corner booth looked tired. A former cop, that much was obvious. His posture was stiff, as if he was still on duty. His Metrovale PD windbreaker was draped over the seat beside him, but it did little to disguise the weariness in his eyes. Malcolm slid into the booth across from him. Naomi sat beside him, arms crossed, her gaze sharp. Let's skip the small talk. Who are you? The man hesitated before speaking. Name's Mark Ellis. I was a detective in Metrovale for 14 years. His voice was low, edged with guilt. I walked away a year ago. Couldn't take it anymore. Malcolm studied him. Couldn't take what? Ellis exhaled sharply. The corruption. The cover-ups. Everything you already know about, I've seen firsthand. He tapped his fingers against the table. But here's what you don't know, Holt has been protecting his officers for years, and he's made sure no one could touch him. The mayor? The city council? They've all played a part in keeping the department untouchable. Naomi frowned. You have proof? Ellis nodded. That's why I reached out. I have audio recordings. Conversations between Holt and top city officials. They talk about burying cases, intimidating witnesses, pressuring judges. They even discuss framing people to protect dirty cops. Malcolm felt a cold weight settle in his chest. You're saying the corruption goes beyond Metrovale PD? Ellis gave a humorless laugh. It goes all the way to the top. Naomi let out a slow breath. If what you're saying is true, we're not just dealing with a lawsuit anymore. This could bring down half the city's leadership. That's exactly why I've kept quiet for so long. Ellis rubbed his temples. I've wanted to do the right thing for years, but if I go public with this, I'm a dead man. Malcolm's jaw tightened. And yet, here you are. Ellis gave a small nod. Because I can't live with it anymore. He slid a small USB drive across the table. This has everything. Every conversation I recorded before I left. But be careful, once you expose this, they'll come for you. Malcolm picked up the drive, his grip firm. They already are. By the time they returned to the office, Naomi was already scanning through the recordings. Malcolm stood behind her, arms crossed, watching the waveform spikes move across the screen as the first audio file played. Then, a voice, clear as day. If Grant keeps pushing this, we bury him. I don't care how. We'll find something. Silence. Then another voice, one Malcolm recognized. Chief Holt. Caldwell and Briggs were sloppy, but I'll clean it up. If we have to manufacture a charge against him, we will. He won't be the first. Naomi turned to Malcolm, her face pale. They weren't just planning to discredit you. They were planning to fabricate charges, maybe even plant evidence. Another voice chimed in. The mayor doesn't want this lawsuit going to court. If you can keep him tangled up in legal trouble, we'll make it go away before it ever sees a jury. Malcolm exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling in. This isn't just about me anymore. They've done this before. If they're this confident, how many others have they buried? Naomi sat back. We need to release this. Now. Malcolm nodded. Not just release it. We need to file federal charges. Jordan, who had been silently listening from the doorway, spoke up. If you do that, it's game over for them. Malcolm's jaw tightened. That's the idea. Naomi hesitated. Once this goes public, we won't just be dealing with bad press. We'll be dealing with desperate men trying to save themselves. They can try. Malcolm's voice was steady. But this time, they won't win. That night, the recordings were leaked. National news networks picked up the story instantly. Holt's voice, the mayor's complicity, the very blueprint of corruption in Metrovale, broadcasted to the entire country. The city erupted. Protests turned into outright demands for resignations. The mayor was cornered, forced to hold an emergency press conference where he denied everything, but no one believed him. At Metrovale PD, chaos unfolded. Officers scrambled, some trying to distance themselves from the scandal, others doubling down. Holt's office was locked down. Inside, Holt sat at his desk, his face stone-cold as he listened to the recordings play on the news. He had survived many storms before, but this was different. His phone rang. He answered, his voice tight. What? A pause? Then a voice, one that made his stomach drop. We told you to control the situation, Holt. You failed. You're on your own now. The line went dead. For the first time, Chief Holt realized he had lost. Malcolm watched the news unfold from his office, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had spent his entire career fighting corrupt systems. But this was the biggest battle he had ever waged. Naomi sat beside him, exhausted but triumphant. We did it. Malcolm didn't respond right away. He knew there was still more to come. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe. They had won this round. But the fight was far from over. The city of Metrovale was in free fall. The leaked recordings had shattered the public's trust in law enforcement, exposing the depths of corruption woven into the highest levels of power. The mayor, the chief of police, and several city officials were now scrambling to contain the fallout. For the first time in decades, Metrovale PD was under federal scrutiny. Protesters no longer just demanded accountability, they demanded mass resignations, arrests, and a complete dismantling of the corrupt institution. Malcolm sat in his office, watching the chaos unfold on the news. Every station carried the story, each headline more damning than the last. Chief Holt under fire following explosive corruption allegations. FBI launches investigation into Metrovale PD cover-ups. Civil rights attorney Malcolm Grant's lawsuit gains national support. Naomi sat across from him, scrolling through her phone. Holt refusing to resign. He's still trying to spin this, blaming a rogue faction within the department. Malcolm scoffed. He's desperate. Jordan entered, tossing a folder onto the desk. Not desperate enough. We just got word, Metrovale PD is retaliating. Malcolm frowned. How? Jordan exhaled. They're going after your clients. The ones involved in the lawsuit. Naomi stiffened. What? They've been sending officers to revisit some of the cases in our suit. One of our plaintiffs, Darius Cole, was pulled over last night and held for questioning for 3 hours without cause. Another, Lisa Benton, had officers show up at her workplace, asking her employer questions about her background. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Holt was playing dirty. He was trying to intimidate anyone connected to Malcolm's case, make them reconsider, make them afraid. Naomi muttered a curse. They're sending a message. Malcolm leaned forward, his fingers pressing against his temple. This was the next phase of their war. He picked up his phone and dialed Darius's number. After a few rings, a tired voice answered. Mr. Grant? Malcolm's voice was firm. Darius, I just heard. Are you okay? A pause. They followed me home last night. His voice was quiet, strained. Parked outside for hours. Malcolm's stomach churned. Listen to me. You are not alone in this. This is intimidation, nothing more. They can't arrest you. They can't hurt you. If anything happens, you call me immediately. Darius hesitated. You really think we can win this? Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. We already are. Inside Metrovale PD headquarters, Chief Holt was unraveling. His office door slammed shut behind him as Lieutenant Monroe stepped inside. She was met with chaos, papers scattered across his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside them. The blinds were closed, casting long shadows over his tired face. Are you seriously still sitting in here drinking? Monroe asked, crossing her arms. Holt shot her a glare. You think this is funny? No, she said. I think it's pathetic. Holt let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his temples. You have no idea what's coming, Monroe. They don't just want me gone. They want to dismantle everything. Maybe they should, Monroe said flatly. Holt's head snapped up, his eyes dark. Watch your mouth? She didn't flinch. Why? Because I'm telling the truth? You and I both know this department isn't salvageable. We should have cleaned house years ago, but instead, you protected your own, covered up the crimes, and buried the truth. And now you're shocked that it's all falling apart. Holt stood, his hands pressing against the desk. Do you have any idea what's at stake? Monroe stepped closer, lowering her voice. I know exactly what's at stake. That's why I gave those files to Malcolm Grant. Holt's face froze. For a moment, the room was so silent Monroe could hear the distant sirens outside. Then Holt chuckled, a low, humorless sound. So it was you? Monroe met his gaze without fear. Yeah, it was me. Holt shook his head. You just destroyed everything. No, Monroe corrected. I gave this city a chance to rebuild. Holt exhaled, rubbing his face. You have no idea what you've done. Monroe turned toward the door. No, Holt. You have no idea what you've done. She left without another word. That night, Malcolm received a text. Unknown number, they know about Monroe. His stomach dropped. A second message followed. Unknown number, she's in danger. Malcolm shot up from his chair. Naomi, he called, grabbing his coat. We have a problem. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe knew the moment she stepped outside the precinct that something was wrong. Her instincts, honed by years of working on the force, screamed at her. She glanced around. The street was quiet, too quiet. Then she saw them. 2 men in unmarked black SUVs. They weren't cops. And they were watching her. Her pulse quickened. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts. She didn't trust many people. But she trusted Malcolm Grant. She hit dial. A second later, his voice came through the speaker. Monroe, I think I made a mistake. Then, the sound of car doors opening. Malcolm heard it too. "Where are you?" Monroe turned, already moving toward her car. "Outside the precinct. 2 SUVs. No plates. Get in your car. Now." Monroe reached for her keys, but it was too late. The sound of fast approaching footsteps. A hand grabbed her wrist. Then, static. The call cut off. Malcolm stood frozen, the dial tone ringing in his ears. Then he grabbed his jacket, his mind racing. Naomi looked up from her laptop, seeing the urgency in his face. "What's wrong?" Malcolm's voice was tight. "Monroe's been taken." Malcolm barely registered the sound of his own heartbeat as he raced down the steps of his office building. The moment Monroe's call had cut off, he knew she was in danger. He didn't know where they had taken her, but he had a gut feeling it wasn't somewhere she'd walk away from easily. Naomi followed behind him, phone in hand, already making calls. "I'm reaching out to some of our sources. Maybe someone saw something." Malcolm climbed into the driver's seat of his car, gripping the wheel. "We don't have time to wait. If Holt's people got to her, they'll make sure she disappears before she can talk." Naomi buckled in, her expression tight. "Then we better find her first." As Malcolm pulled onto the road, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. 1108 Southridge Avenue. "Warehouse. You don't have much time." Malcolm's stomach twisted. Whoever was on the other end of this knew what was happening. And they wanted him to find Monroe. He showed Naomi the message. She frowned. "Trap? Probably," Malcolm admitted. "But it's the only lead we have." Naomi exhaled. "Then let's go." The warehouse was in an abandoned industrial district, just outside the city limits. The kind of place people didn't ask questions about. As Malcolm and Naomi pulled up, the lot was nearly empty, except for 2 black SUVs parked near the entrance. Malcolm killed the engine. Naomi eyed the building. "We should call for backup." "There is no backup," Malcolm said grimly. "If we call the police, they'll just tip Holt off." Naomi sighed, grabbing her phone. "Then let's at least tell someone we're here." She quickly texted Jordan, dropping their location and the situation. Then, she slipped the phone into her pocket. "All right? Let's do this." They moved quickly, keeping low as they approached the side of the warehouse. The metal structure loomed over them, its windows broken, its walls streaked with rust. A faint murmur of voices echoed from inside. Malcolm peered through a crack in the door. Inside, Monroe was tied to a chair in the middle of the concrete floor. A small trickle of blood ran down her forehead, and her breathing was shaky but steady. 2 men in dark clothing stood nearby, watching her. Then, Malcolm spotted a third figure, a man pacing the room, his voice sharp. "Chief Holt." His presence sent a new wave of fury through Malcolm's veins. "We should have handled you a long time ago, Monroe," Holt was saying. His tone was casual, almost conversational. "But you just had to push it, didn't you?" Monroe's laugh was weak but defiant. "Sorry if I ruined your little empire." Holt stopped pacing. "You don't get it, do you? You think Malcolm Grant is going to save you? That exposing us is going to make a difference." He let out a cold chuckle. "Let me tell you something, we don't lose." Monroe's gaze, despite the bruises forming along her cheek, was unshaken. "You've already lost, Holt. You just don't know it yet." Holt's expression darkened. Malcolm felt Naomi tense beside him. "We need to move," she whispered. Malcolm nodded. They couldn't wait any longer. His pulse quickened as he reached for the steel pipe leaning against the outside wall. He gripped it tight, then counted to 3. Then, he kicked the door open. The bang echoed through the warehouse. Holt and his men spun around. For a brief second, no one moved. Then, Malcolm swung. The first man barely had time to react before the pipe collided with his ribs. He let out a grunt, doubling over. Naomi darted forward, grabbing a metal tool from a nearby crate and slamming it into the second man's knee. The room erupted into chaos. Monroe used the distraction to twist in her chair, kicking out her leg and knocking Holt off balance. Malcolm turned toward him, but Holt was already pulling a gun. The world slowed. For a second, Malcolm thought it was over. Then, a gunshot. But it wasn't Holt's. It was Monroe's. Holt's eyes widened as he staggered back, his hand clutching his shoulder. Blood bloomed through his uniform. Monroe, still tied to the chair, had somehow managed to grab the gun from the holster of the man beside her. The warehouse fell into silence. Holt stared at Malcolm, realization dawning in his face. He had lost. Sirens blared in the distance. Naomi exhaled. Guess Jordan called backup after all. Malcolm stepped forward, standing over Holt. For years, this man had ruled Metrovale with unchecked power. Now, he was bleeding on a warehouse floor, his reign crumbling around him. You were right about one thing, Malcolm said. We don't lose. Holt laughed bitterly, his face pale. This isn't over. Malcolm met his gaze, unshaken. Yes, it is. The moment the police stormed the warehouse, Chief Holt's empire officially collapsed. The flashing red and blue lights outside the warehouse cast eerie shadows against the rusted walls. The sirens had barely faded before dozens of officers stormed in, weapons drawn, barking orders. For the first time in his career, Chief Holt was on the other side of the badge. Malcolm watched as the officers rushed past him, securing the scene, handcuffing the remaining men. Monroe, still tied to the chair, had slumped forward slightly, breathing heavily but alive. An officer ran up to her, quickly cutting the ropes binding her wrists. You all right, Lieutenant? Monroe winced as she rolled her shoulders. Been better. Holt, still clutching his wounded shoulder, glared at Malcolm as two officers grabbed his arms and hauled him to his feet. His once proud uniform was stained with blood, his face pale from the pain. But his expression was still defiant. You think this changes anything? Holt growled, struggling against the officers. You think you've won? Malcolm stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with conviction. No, Holt. I know we have. The officers shoved Holt forward, forcing him toward a squad car waiting outside. The same man who had ordered false arrests, covered up crimes, and wielded his power like a weapon was now just another criminal in handcuffs. Naomi exhaled beside Malcolm, crossing her arms. I could watch that on repeat. Monroe let out a weak chuckle, wincing as she stood up. You and me both? One of the responding officers, Captain Daniel Briggs, approached with a grim expression. We've got Holt and his men in custody, but this mess is bigger than just them. The mayor's office is scrambling. The city council is in a panic. Malcolm nodded. They should be. Briggs hesitated before speaking again. Word is, the feds are stepping in. They want a full-scale investigation into the Metrovale Police Department. Malcolm exchanged a glance with Naomi. This was it. The moment they had been fighting for. They're calling it the largest corruption probe in Metrovale history, Briggs continued. Everyone who played a part in covering this up is getting dragged into it. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Including the mayor? Briggs nodded. Especially the mayor. Monroe sighed. Guess he should have picked better friends. Briggs turned to Malcolm, his expression unreadable. You've done something here, Grant. Something that's going to change this city forever. Malcolm studied the chaos around him, the officers loading Holt and his men into the police vans, the flashing cameras from reporters who had arrived at the scene, the murmurs of people beginning to realize that Metrovale's most powerful man had finally fallen. We're not done yet, Malcolm said. Not until every last corrupt officer is held accountable. Briggs nodded. The department is a mess. We need a new system, new leadership, a complete reset. He glanced at Monroe. We need people we can trust to rebuild it. Monroe scoffed. You asking me to fix your broken system, Captain? Briggs shrugged. You're the only one who hasn't been caught up in the scandal. People respect you. Monroe rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. Naomi nudged Malcolm. If she takes the job, you realize you just put your biggest client in charge of the very system you fight against. Malcolm smirked. I'd rather see it in the hands of someone who actually gives a damn. Monroe shook her head. You two need to stop making sense. It's exhausting. Briggs cleared his throat. I'll be in touch, Monroe. Just think about it. As he walked off, Monroe sighed. What the hell did I get myself into? Malcolm chuckled. A revolution? 2 days later, Metrovale was a different city. Chief Holt's arrest had ignited a political wildfire. His downfall sent shockwaves through the police force, the local government, and even state officials who had turned a blind eye for years. The mayor, desperate to distance himself from the scandal, had held a press conference announcing his resignation. City council members, fearing exposure, were scrambling to save their own careers. And at the heart of it all, Malcolm stood on the steps of Metrovale's courthouse, addressing the crowd of reporters and citizens who had gathered to witness history unfold. I have fought cases like this for years, Malcolm began, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. I have sat across from families who lost loved ones to corrupt officers. I have stood in courtrooms, arguing against a system that was designed to protect itself. He let his words settle before continuing. But this is different. For the first time, we didn't just expose corruption. We dismantled it. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. But the work isn't over, Malcolm continued. Metrovale PD must be rebuilt from the ground up. Policies must change. The people must demand more. Because if we don't, history will repeat itself. And I refuse to let that happen. Naomi stood beside him, arms crossed, a rare look of pride on her face. Monroe, now wearing a temporary badge as acting police chief, stood on the courthouse steps, watching the speech. She wasn't sure how she had ended up here, but if she had learned one thing from Malcolm Grant, it was this: change didn't happen by sitting on the sidelines. Malcolm finished his speech with one final statement. This city belongs to the people, not to corrupt leaders, not to unchecked power, but to those who fight for justice. And we will keep fighting. The crowd erupted in cheers. The moment Malcolm stepped away from the podium, reporters swarmed, asking for comments. He smiled at Naomi. I think we just made history. Naomi smirked. No, Malcolm. You made history. And for the first time in years, Malcolm allowed himself to believe it. The weight of Metrovale's transformation was still settling in. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind: Chief Holt's arrest, the mayor's resignation, the mass firings of corrupt officers, and now, the slow, painful process of rebuilding a broken system. Malcolm sat in his office, staring at a stack of case files spread across his desk. Names. Faces. Stories of injustice. Some were from the past, cases he had fought and won. Others were new, fresh wounds from a city still struggling to heal. He rubbed his temple, exhaustion creeping in. The fight never really ended. The door creaked open, and Naomi stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. You look like you need this. Malcolm chuckled, taking one. That obvious. Naomi sat across from him, sipping her drink. You just took down one of the most corrupt police departments in the country, forced a mayor to resign, and got half the city's leadership indicted. I'd say you've earned a break. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. And yet, here I am. Still buried in case files. Naomi smirked. You wouldn't be Malcolm Grant if you weren't. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jordan peeked in. There's someone here to see you. Malcolm sighed, rubbing his eyes. Please tell me it's not another reporter. Jordan hesitated. Not exactly. It's an officer. Naomi and Malcolm exchanged a look. Which officer? Malcolm asked cautiously. Jordan stepped aside, revealing Officer Damian Lewis. Lewis looked uncomfortable in his uniform, as if it no longer fit right. His expression was hesitant, conflicted. Malcolm motioned him in. Naomi leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Brave of you to show up here, considering everything that just went down. Lewis exhaled. Yeah, I know. He glanced at Malcolm. I just needed to say something. And I figured you were the only person I could say it to. Malcolm gestured for him to sit. Go on. Lewis hesitated before speaking. I've been a cop for 8 years. When I started, I really thought I was doing the right thing. Thought I was protecting people. But over time, I saw what was really happening. He swallowed hard. I saw the false reports, the harassment, the cover-ups. I knew it was wrong, but I told myself I couldn't change anything. So I did nothing. He exhaled sharply, gripping his knees. Until I saw what they did to you. That was the moment I realized that if I kept staying silent, I wasn't just part of the department, I was part of the problem. Naomi raised an eyebrow. So what? You want forgiveness? Lewis shook his head. No. I don't deserve that. He turned to Malcolm. I wanted you to know. Not all of us were like Holt. Not all of us wanted this. Malcolm studied him for a long moment. He had spent his life fighting against men like Holt, but Lewis? He was different. After a pause, Malcolm nodded. Then help fix what's broken. Lewis looked up, surprised. If you really mean what you're saying, then don't just walk away from the mess you helped enable, Malcolm continued. Stay. Fight for something better. Make sure this department doesn't fall back into the same corruption. Lewis let out a slow breath, nodding. I want to. I don't know if I can, but I want to. Monroe's voice suddenly filled the room. Then prove it. Everyone turned as Lieutenant, no, now acting chief, Rachel Monroe stepped into the office. She looked at Lewis with a calculating gaze. We need good cops. If you're serious about changing things, then step up. Lewis hesitated, then stood, nodding firmly. I'm in. Monroe smirked. Good. Malcolm watched the exchange, allowing himself a rare moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Metrovale PD could be something better. That night, Malcolm stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking over the city. The streets below were quieter than they had been in weeks. The protests had begun to die down, not because people stopped caring, but because they finally saw change happening. Metrovale was far from perfect, but it was better than it had been yesterday. Naomi stepped onto the balcony beside him, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. She handed him one. You did it, she said. Malcolm took the glass, shaking his head with a small smirk. No. We did. Naomi clinked her glass against his. To burning corrupt systems to the ground? Malcolm chuckled. And building something better in their place? As he looked out at the city, he knew the fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for now, just for a moment, it felt like a victory. Malcolm woke to the sound of his phone vibrating against the nightstand. He groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. Unknown number. His pulse quickened. He sat up, rubbing his face before answering. Malcolm Grant? Silence. Then, a voice, low, calm, dangerous. You made a mistake. Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? The voice chuckled. You think you won? That because Holt's gone, this is over. Malcolm didn't respond. You have no idea what you've stepped into, Mr. Grant. A pause. You don't take down a system without making enemies. And trust me, you've made enemies. The line went dead. Malcolm sat frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He had expected retaliation, but this? This was different. Naomi appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day, a coffee in hand. She took one look at his expression and frowned. What happened? Malcolm exhaled, setting the phone down. A warning? Naomi took a seat on the edge of his bed. From who? No idea. He ran a hand down his face. But they're pissed. Naomi leaned back, sighing. Well, yeah. We just took down their whole operation. They're scrambling. Malcolm shook his head. No, Naomi. This wasn't desperation. This was a promise. She studied him for a moment before setting her coffee down. All right. What's our next move? Malcolm didn't hesitate. We push forward. The next few days were a blur of legal motions, media appearances, and strategy meetings. With the lawsuit moving forward and the FBI investigation widening, more victims came forward, former officers, citizens, even local business owners who had been extorted by Metrovale PD. But as their case gained momentum, so did the threats. Anonymous messages. Surveillance cars parked outside Malcolm's office. A break-in at Naomi's apartment, though nothing was stolen, just a message left in red spray paint on her wall. Back OFF. Naomi was furious. They're getting desperate. Malcolm clenched his jaw. Good. But deep down, he knew things were escalating. Then came the news report. Breaking, FBI expands corruption investigation beyond Metrovale PD, city officials under scrutiny. Malcolm sat in his office, watching the broadcast. The rot in Metrovale wasn't just in the police force. It ran deeper, into City Hall, the courts, even the state legislature. Naomi walked in, holding a folder of new documents. You're gonna want to see this. She tossed it on the desk, and Malcolm flipped it open. What he saw made his stomach drop. Bank records. Wire transfers. Money moving between Metrovale's police union, city officials, and private interests. Naomi crossed her arms. This isn't just about Holt and his officers. The corruption goes all the way up. Malcolm exhaled. They had uncovered something even bigger than they had imagined. This case isn't just about Metrovale anymore, he murmured. Naomi nodded. No. It's about the whole damn system. That night, as Malcolm left the office, he noticed something off. The street was quiet, too quiet. He glanced around, his instincts on high alert. Then, a black SUV idled at the curb, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Malcolm's heart pounded. Then, the window rolled down. And inside, a man in a dark suit and sunglasses stared at him. No words. No gestures. Just a warning. Malcolm clenched his fists. They weren't trying to scare him anymore. They were watching. And they weren't done yet. The city of Metrovale was forever changed. The foundations of power that had once seemed untouchable were now collapsing, crumbling under the weight of their own corruption. Chief Holt was behind bars, the former mayor was indicted, and the police department was undergoing a complete overhaul under new leadership. But Malcolm Grant knew better than anyone that real change wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about making sure it never returned. The sun had barely risen, casting long golden streaks across the Metrovale skyline, when Malcolm found himself back in his office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, reform proposals, and case files. Sleep had been a distant memory for weeks now. The victory felt monumental, yet he understood that winning a battle wasn't the same as winning the war. Naomi entered, holding 2 cups of coffee, and slid one onto his desk. "You look like hell." Malcolm smirked, taking the cup gratefully. "Thanks for that." She sat across from him, sipping her drink. "So, what now?" Malcolm exhaled, leaning back. "We rebuild." He gestured to the files stacked on his desk. "New policies, new oversight committees, independent review boards. If we don't restructure the system itself, we'll just end up right back where we started." Naomi nodded, taking another sip of her coffee before setting the cup down. "I've been thinking about that. Metrovale isn't the only city dealing with this level of corruption. What if we take this national? Start a legal movement?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "You want to expand the fight?" Naomi shrugged. "Why not? We just dismantled an entire network of corrupt cops and politicians. Imagine what we could do on a larger scale." The idea settled between them, thick with possibilities. Malcolm considered it, tapping his fingers against the desk. The idea was bold. Maybe even reckless. But it was also right. They had exposed a single corrupt system, but there were dozens more just like it, thriving in the dark corners of cities across the country. If Metrovale could be cleaned up, then why stop there? He set his coffee down, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Then let's do it." Naomi grinned. "I thought you'd say that." A week later, Malcolm stood on the steps of Metrovale's courthouse, looking out at a crowd larger than any before. The people of the city weren't just protesting anymore. They were celebrating. The corruption was exposed. The leaders who had failed them were gone. And now, the people were reclaiming their city. Naomi and Monroe stood beside him. Monroe, now officially the new chief of police, had already begun implementing massive reforms within the department. She adjusted her badge, glancing at Malcolm. "Never thought I'd be here." Malcolm smirked. "Never thought I'd be shaking hands with Metrovale PD." She chuckled. "Well, I guess we both had our expectations blown apart." Naomi nudged Malcolm. "Speech time?" Malcolm took a deep breath, stepping up to the podium. Thousands of eyes turned to him, waiting. The energy in the air was unlike anything he had ever felt before, a mixture of relief, triumph, and hope. "We did not fight this battle just to remove a few corrupt officials. We did not risk everything just to settle for small victories." He looked at the crowd, at the families, at the people who had suffered under a system built against them. "We fought for something bigger. And today, Metrovale takes its first step toward something better." The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the city streets. He let the noise settle before continuing. "This is not just about Metrovale. This is about every city, every community that has ever suffered under a system that prioritizes power over justice. For years, corruption was allowed to thrive because those in power thought no one would ever challenge them. But they were wrong." He paused, looking into the sea of faces, activists, families of victims, citizens who had fought for justice. They were wrong because they underestimated you. The people of Metrovale refused to stay silent. You demanded better. And you got it? A loud applause erupted. Malcolm continued, his voice steady. "But let's be clear, this isn't over. Real justice isn't just about removing corrupt leaders, it's about ensuring they are never replaced by more of the same. It's about building something stronger, something that lasts." He gripped the podium. "We will not stop. We will not be silent. Because justice is not a moment, it's a movement." The crowd exploded into thunderous applause. Naomi, standing beside him, whispered, "Damn. You do know how to bring the house down." Malcolm chuckled, stepping back as reporters swarmed forward, asking for comments. He answered a few before stepping away, letting the moment sink in. This wasn't just about one lawsuit, one police department, one city. This was the beginning of something much larger. That evening, back at the office, Malcolm finally let himself breathe. The city outside was changing, the weight of corruption lifting. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was better. Naomi walked in, a bottle of whiskey in her hand. She poured 2 glasses, sliding one to Malcolm before sitting across from him. "You did it," she said, raising her glass. Malcolm smirked. "No, we did." They clinked glasses, taking a sip. "So, where do we go from here?" Naomi asked. Malcolm stared at the skyline. "We take this fight national." Naomi grinned. "Good answer." He let the weight of the moment settle, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But that was fine. Because justice wasn't just a battle, it was a lifelong war. And Malcolm Grant was just getting started.